Brussels Bites, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi, a new political season has just started in Brussels as the European Commission and Parliament are preparing the new term. Commissioner portfolios are reshuffled, bargains are being made. Of course, the Martin Centre will be following and contributing to many of the noteworthy policies and political priorities which will dominate the European agenda. In today's episode, we would like to dedicate some time on a topic of economic security, an issue which will be among the key priorities in the next 5 years. The EU is facing a number of growing challenges from external actors in terms of geopolitical tensions and profound technological shifts. These challenges are not unique to the EU, as many of our international allies are faced by the very same threats and vulnerabilities. This is why the Martin Centre recently commissioned a dedicated report on the future perspectives for transatlantic economic security. Why and how can the EU and US cooperate better in responding to economic coercion from actors like the People's Republic of China? Our report looks at important issues such as systemic rivalry with China, supply chain dependencies, and access to critical technologies. It also puts forward a number of recommendations for policymakers in Brussels and Washington. Our today's guests are the two authors of the report who are part of the China Strategic Risk Institute, a global policy think tank dedicated on analyzing the risks and opportunities posed by the rise of China. And I'm really happy that today we're joined by Andrew Ye, who is the Executive Director of the China Strategic Risk Institute, or CSRI. His research work includes the green technology supply chain and Europe's relationship with Taiwan. We're also joined by Sam Goodman, who is the Policy Director of CSRI. He has a background in British foreign policy and is also the author of The Imperial Premiership, the role of modern prime ministers in foreign policy making. Andrew, Sam, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Maybe we can kick off and you can tell us a bit more about CSRI and your mission.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dimitar. It's really a privilege to be hosting this podcast with you. So the China Strategic Risk Institute was really launched as a response to what we see to be some of the key strategic risks emanating from an increasingly powerful, more assertive, and ever more authoritarian China. We are a policy-focused think tank, so we are working with policymakers in the European Union, the UK, Canada, and elsewhere to understand and mitigate these risks. I suppose just in terms of thinking about the broader systemic rivalry between the US, Europe, and China, it's helpful to think about three key strategic risks, which we are particularly concerned about and which really frame, I think, some of our discussions in this report. So first is our increased dependence on China across critical supply chains. This was a dependency that was very much highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic, not just across the green technology supply chain, but also in rare earth elements and pharmaceuticals and other areas. Second is the increasing integration of Chinese technology into our critical infrastructure. We're seeing this particularly with the transition to green energy and green transportation, and we think this brings a number of data security and cybersecurity risks. And then lastly, China's advances in critical future technologies. So we know that China is really leading the world when it comes to the academic research in technologies such as defense, space, biotechnology, artificial intelligence. China will continue to lead these advances. It may begin to monopolize some of these industries, leading to further strategic dependencies on China from the US and Europe. So those are just some of the key rivalries that are really underpinning our discussion today.
Yeah, you just pinpointed quite a comprehensive list of potential challenges. Maybe we can dig deeper in a couple of those. Sam, maybe we can walk us through more specifically about supply chain dependencies or questions like overcapacity. What exactly do they mean when we talk about Chinese threats and risks here?
Sure. I think just to set some context for your listeners, the reality is that Xi Jinping has had this made in China 2025 policy for about 10 years, which really has been cornering the green technology market, while unfortunately a lot of us in Europe and in America have been asleep to those risks. And we're now getting to a point where they essentially have a lot of cheap green technology that they're able to export to the world. They have a lot of mass excess capacity in their factories, and they're dumping a lot of this stuff globally. And just to give your listeners sort of summation of the problem, China's global market share of the solar market is about 81%. When it comes to electric vehicles, they produce 60% of the world's EVs. And when it comes to the lithium batteries within them, they produce about 75%. And then when you talk about the downstream supply chain, so the critical minerals themselves, China is a sort of one-stop shop for critical mineral refinement. So, the EU and the US spend a lot of time talking about how they can diversify critical mineral supply chains away from China, essentially digging these minerals out of the ground. But the problem is that Europe continues to send a huge amount of those critical minerals to be processed in China. 68% of nickel is processed in China, 59% of the lithium that go into those lithium batteries, and 73% of cobalt. So China has a huge dominance when it comes to the green technology market. Now, economically in China, as a lot of your listeners will have read, they're facing an economic downturn. Their population has peaked, it's shrinking. Foreign investors are spooked by a number of crackdowns in a variety of sectors, ranging from education to technology to finance. And more broadly, their solution is to essentially export their excess manufacturing capacity, essentially export for growth. But that requires Europe's markets, America's markets to be open. And the real risk here is to European manufacturing jobs. Take, for example, the automotive industry. The automotive industry accounts for about 8.5% of EU employment in manufacturing. And in terms of direct and indirect jobs, there's about another 13.8 million jobs. This is a huge amount of jobs that could be put at risk if China is able to flood Europe with cheap Chinese EVs. So it is very much an economic risk. The other thing to think about is not just Chinese EVs being exported or rather imported into Europe. It's also about competition in China and in third markets. The news about Volkswagen potentially closing a factory in Wolfsburg because they're being squeezed, particularly in China, which makes up a huge amount of their profits, is part of this story. The other part of the story is when it comes to third markets, the Indo-Pacific, Brazil, Africa, Latin America, where again, Chinese cars are just far more competitive when it comes to EVs. And so this is, what we worry about is that there's a perfect storm for European automotive companies where they're losing market share in China, they're getting out-competed in third markets, and then Chinese EV companies may get in the next couple of years, between 25% to maybe a third of the market.
Thanks, Sam. And you are making a very valid point on dominance when it comes to critical raw materials in lithium and cobalt and rare earths. When we think about, in comparison, the notorious monopolistic grip of OPEC, the international cartel on crude oil supply, these guys have around 40 or 50% of global production. And in China's case, when we talk about these minerals and these raw earths, we're talking about 67, 80%. So it's even more than OPEC's grip on crude oil supply. But Sam, how about EVs? Given the potential imports of Chinese EVs, given that the costs are going down, isn't cheaper and more available EVs a good thing for Europe, given our climate goals and the fact that European consumers are thinking about pivoting to new electric vehicles?
I mean, I think that is quite a valid argument that we hear quite a lot when it comes to our research. But, as ever is the way, the argument is far more complex. First of all, it's worth noting that a lot of EVs these days, to call them vehicles is being generous. They're computers on wheels. They have a huge amount of technology inside them. They have sensors outside of them. They have video cameras, taking a huge amount of data when they're driving around. They're connected to clouds where they store the data centers. And so it isn't just about, decarbonizing our economies, which we all need to do. There's also a huge data security element here. And it's worth pointing out a couple of things. One, because of this concept called civil and military fusion, which essentially means that PRC companies work hand in glove with a military apparatus in China, it means that when they do make these developments in technology, they have to work with the military. They're exposed to that. The second point is a number of laws in China require them to transfer data back to China, irrespective of where they're based. So you have something called the PRC National Intelligence Law that was introduced in 2017, and the PRC's Data Security Law, that both require Chinese companies essentially to transfer user data back to China. And in the case of the PRC National Intelligence Law, they're not allowed to declare to a foreign government or a foreign party the extent of that data collection. So in some ways, it makes it very hard for EU regulators to find out whether these companies would be GDPR compliant. But as you alluded to, there's a huge problem about dependency risk as well. And we've seen in the past the way that the PRC has effectively weaponized economic dependencies from Australia to the recent case of Lithuania as well. And the EU has responded to that quite well with this anti-coercion measure. But, lawmakers in Brussels, but also the Commission, need to be very wary and cognizant of the way that deepening dependency in the wider green technology supply chain could be weaponized by the PRC.
Maybe if we can stay on EVs for just one more minute, given that it's a very, very big topic. I've been hearing a number of voices in the US already flagging this issue, Sam, about data security and potential transfer of data. And there's even people who consider that the Americans might use exactly this avenue so that it additionally blocks the imports of Chinese vehicles. And on top of that, we've already seen how they increased the tariffs on imported EVs up to 100%. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you think that the US and the EU are going to deviate in terms of approach? Here in Brussels, we already have a conversation about countervailing duties. But do you think that we have the same approach when it comes to EVs, or we're going to deviate in Europe?
I mean, I would like to be optimistic about it, because I think if you look where the EU was 6 months ago, before economic security was really put on the agenda, and when the EU Commission was first announcing this investigation, many people thought it wouldn't go anywhere. They were very, very skeptical. And we're now, in a week where EU Council members are discussing the draft tariff measures. They're going to be voting on them in the next couple of weeks. So given how slow-moving Brussels is, I think we're all aware of that. There is reason to be optimistic. But you are right. The tariff schedule that the EU is proposing is quite low, and they've allowed Chinese EV companies to negotiate directly with the Commission to get reductions. If you look at some of the research the Rhodium Group has done, they've made it very clear that tariffs lower than 50% will not break the profit margin for these Chinese EV companies. And it therefore means that they will still make a huge profit on the cars that they sell in Europe. Now, if the rationale of some of the EU member states is that they want these tariffs to force Chinese EV companies into joint partnerships with European car manufacturers, that simply won't happen, because there's no financial incentive for it if you're a BYD or a SAC. And so until that changes, I don't think they'll get the desired result. And to your point about data security, you're right. The National Security Council in the US right now is doing a huge investigation into the data vulnerabilities of connected vehicles and China. And there's a hope that in the next couple of months, they'll publish that, they'll make that available for Five Eyes and European partners. And all of us can have a more informed discussion about the very legitimate risks there are that go beyond, obviously, some of the theoretical things that these cars can do at the moment.
I advise our listeners to go through our report, which comes out in early October, where you can find additional input about EVs and also about critical technologies and the potential joint risks we have in the EU and also in the US vis-a-vis China. But enough about analyzing the problem, because we can spend a long time focused on these topics and these problems. But maybe, Andrew, can you walk us through some of the most pertinent policy recommendations from your report, and what action should we be advocating for in US and in Brussels?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think what you find is that although the EU and the US are trying to solve a lot of the same problems, the approach that they have for doing so is really quite different. I mean, as Sam has alluded to, we've seen a huge divergence in terms of the US's much more stringent and much broader use of tariffs, not just on EVs, but also on the solar PV sector, which is an area where the EU has dropped its tariff, its anti-subsidy investigation. And then we've also clearly, through the Inflation Reduction Act, also seen the US take a much more forthright approach to subsidies. If you compare the level of subsidies provided through the IRA compared to what individual member states in the EU are doing through the temporary crisis and transition framework, they really, they're really incomparable in terms of the larger scale of the US support. So very much what we are proposing in our report is firstly a joint mechanism for investment between the EU and the US. It's quite interesting for us that the much touted G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, of which the EU Global Gateway is a part, has died a bit of a quiet death as policymakers in the EU and the US try and work out what to do with it. Well, we think actually coordinating investments back into the green technology supply chain to enable some diversification from China in critical areas such as lithium batteries, such as EVs, or even kind of more critical future-leaning technologies. That is the place really where I think that investment could make an impact. So coordinate investment between the EU and US, particularly in countries which can actually produce a lot of this stuff much more cheaply than the European or American markets. Some of the stuff we want to be able to produce in Europe, it can bring jobs, that's great. But actually, places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Latin America, Africa can produce a lot of these technologies much more cheaply than the EU or the US ever could. So actually there's a strong investment case for investing in supply chains there as well. And then just another recommendation I will pull out from our report as well is, as Sam alluded to earlier, on deepening the work that is already happening in the Minerals Security Partnership, but particularly to focus on the minerals processing stage. That is the choke point in the supply chain when it comes to China. We can extract the minerals elsewhere in the world, whether that's Africa, Latin America, or even sometimes within Europe and America. But the problem is that has been sent back to China for processing, and that has an impact on everything from the electric vehicle supply chain through to semiconductors, defense and weapons and so on. So making sure that the Minerals Security Partnership is better funded and can really invest in the processing side of the supply chain has to be a priority for the EU, the US, and their partners.
I completely agree with these points, and I hope we see some of them in action. Now, the question back to you is, do you think that there's actual appetite from the US side on closely coordinating with the EU on these issues? Let's look at October 22 when the US decided to implement extraterritorial export controls on semiconductors and advanced tech without liaising with European allies, or at least publicly. Let's think of the galvanizing new tariffs on Chinese imports coming from Washington. So do we really see an avenue for joint action, or America is more willing to go at it alone?
Well, I think that there is a danger that America will take the opinion that it is better off going alone. So I think it is up to Europe to make a convincing case to the US that it is worth cooperating, it is worth working together. It is not just about each country taking their own national interest first. But I do think that ultimately both Europe and the US are facing the same challenges. They are, operating in the same space. So actually there is, much areas for cooperation in this regard.
And I think that the same goes, by the way, to European member states as well, because even if we, here in Brussels or in European institutions, if we do have the realization about potential Chinese risks to the EU as a whole, when we look at specific member state capitals, the dynamic is quite different. I mean, we have the notorious case of Germany, which is quite sheepish to suddenly move when it comes to Chinese trade imbalances, for example, or network security, trusted vendors within its networks. A week ago, we saw the somewhat sheepish statement by the Spanish Prime Minister when it comes to reassessing our attitude towards Chinese EVs and tariffs. So, question to both of you, how likely are member state capitals to tolerate pain or even financial negative impacts in order to achieve economic security and decouple from the Chinese or implement decisive measures in this aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be a fine balance struck, really, between going further on economic security, but also ensuring that it's done in a way that supports EU jobs, supports investment, this sort of thing. I think where things are falling short is the fact that you still have the carrot of Chinese inbound investment going into Europe. So, you cite the example of Spain. The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez was in Beijing, and, clearly there are announcements of green energy projects in Spain that have had some influence over some of the statements that have come out by the Spanish government about whether they will abstain on this EU Council vote regarding the tariffs. There are long-standing concerns about German investment in China. Germany makes up about 2/3 of Europe's foreign direct investment in China. So Germany is key to a lot of this. But I think, the way forward for this is that other EU member states need to speak up for their interests and make it clear that it isn't just about national self-interest. There's shared European self-interest here. You take the example of Volkswagen. They have a supply chain in Czechia, in Slovakia, in the Baltics as well. If they run into financial trouble, a lot of these businesses in these countries will run into financial trouble as well. So it can't just be seen as a German problem. And I think in the case of the EU tariffs as well, if they don't pass after the huge amount of spectacle that has been made about them, the huge row about them, if somehow China was able to divide the EU Council and stop them, it would create a bigger story about PRC influence in Europe and what that really means for the role of the EU geopolitically as well, and in protecting its own economic security. So I think some of these issues have to be weighed up as well in the minds of the EU member states. And as ever is the way, I think, a huge amount of our time we focus on one or two or three specific EU member states who are always publicly discussed. But I'm always fascinated by the quiet ones in the EU Council who sometimes are actually quite sympathetic to the PRC, but we just don't hear that much about them. And so I think, as ever is the way, I think light is a good way for dealing with these issues. What would be good is to see more transparency about these discussions, that they happen in the open. We would like to see more of these EU Council discussions in the open, particularly as it pertains to dealing with economic dependency on China.
Great. Dear friends, I hope you enjoyed this teaser when it comes to transatlantic relations and the systemic risks stemming from China. You can read more and get a deep dive on all of these issues in our upcoming report on Forging a Path on Transatlantic Economic Security, a joint report by the Martin Center and the China Strategic Risks Institute. And thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sam, for this wonderful conversation. And stay tuned for more content by the Martin Center.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bites. Follow us on SoundCloud for more.